In the heart of the Egyptian desert, where time seems to stand still and the wind carries forgotten secrets, an unlikely discovery broke the silence that had lasted for centuries. Inside a remote cave, shrouded in darkness and oblivion, lay a scroll as old as the first roots of the Christian faith. What many had ignored for generations would shake the foundations of one of the most established pillars of Western religious tradition. When the manuscript came to light, its fragile condition revealed that it had not been touched by human hands in a long time. However, it was the content inscribed on its crumbling pages that caused astonishment among historians and scholars. The central figure in the text was someone well known, but for reasons that had been passed down through the centuries under a single label: treason. His name, almost always invoked with revulsion, appeared there with a different connotation. Something was out of place, and it was not insignificant. Over the millennia, what has been called history has often served as an instrument of power. Whoever controlled the records determined what would be remembered and what should be forgotten. This scroll, however, narrowly escaped the hands that tried to erase its existence. Its contents called into question one of the most emblematic passages of Christianity, suggesting that the official truth was perhaps not the only one, nor the most faithful to the original events. The manuscript was not part of the Gospels accepted in the New Testament. It was an outcast, a text that, although written at the same time as others considered sacred, was discarded, silenced, and finally buried by time, until it was rediscovered, almost by accident, and caused a stir behind the scenes of archaeology and theology. The path that led to its rediscovery was tortuous. In the last years of the 20th century, it resurfaced discreetly, passing from private collectors to specialized academics, always shrouded in mystery. Its content, studied in detail, revealed not only a new perspective on familiar events, but also a totally different understanding of the role of a disciple whom the world had learned to hate. Among the many questions that arose, one stood out: why was this gospel excluded? Similar writings were preserved, discussed, and even integrated into parallel traditions. But this one in particular was treated as a threat. What real danger was hidden in its words? Careful reading showed that the text did not merely give voice to a marginalized character, it altered the very meaning of his supposed betrayal. What had always been seen as the greatest breach of trust in sacred history was described there in a different light, an act done consciously, perhaps even with Jesus' consent. The paradigm shift began right there. During the first centuries of Christianity, many accounts circulated among the faithful. Each group produced its own records, seeking to preserve what it believed to be the authentic teaching. Over time, an effort at unification silenced these dissenting voices. Texts that deviated from official doctrine were labeled false or dangerous and eliminated. Even so, this gospel survived, protected by layers of earth and dust, as if the desert itself had decided to hide it until the world was ready. When it was found, it was no longer a threat, but a valuable piece of the puzzle for understanding a past that was never as simple as it seemed. Within those fragile pages were records of dialogues, reflections, and episodes that do not appear in the four Gospels of the traditional Bible. Each sentence seemed to unearth ancient questions that had never been answered. Above all, it reopened the debate about what really happened in the days leading up to the crucifixion. The past rarely reaches us in its original form. What is remembered and taught often depends less on the facts and more on who had the power to choose which memories would be preserved. In the early centuries of Christianity, there was an impressive diversity of records about the teachings and life of Jesus. Texts written by different communities in distant regions presented different versions of who he was and what his message was. These works coexisted, circulating among followers and creating a pluralistic landscape of interpretations and beliefs. At that time, there was no centralized authority. Christianity was a movement in formation, composed of groups that shared only a common foundation, but differed in many fundamental ways. For some, Jesus was essentially human, a teacher of wisdom and compassion. For others, he was a divine manifestation whose presence in this material world was only apparent. There were still others, such as the Gnostics, who saw salvation as a process of inner revelation, guided by hidden knowledge, inaccessible to those who were not ready to understand it. This multiplicity of views began to become uncomfortable as the structure of the church grew stronger. A fragmented faith was a risk, and the existence of so many contradictory texts compromised the stability of a single doctrine. It was then that the need arose to organize, select, and above all, exclude. The unification of the Christian message required the establishment of a clear body of doctrine, with unquestionable foundations and centralized authority. The movement toward this goal was not rapid. During the first 3 centuries, many of these alternative gospels were still read in Christian communities, but the process of centralization gained momentum when church leaders began to openly combat so-called deviant teachings. One of the first to attempt to define which gospels were acceptable was Irenaeus of Lyon. In his work, written around the year 180, he argued that only 4 gospels should be considered legitimate. The choice, according to him, had a symbolic basis. 4 winds, 4 cardinal points, 4 pillars supporting the knowledge of truth. Irenaeus's position was not immediately imposed, but it marked the beginning of a growing movement to exclude alternative views. Over the following centuries, Gnostic texts and other gospels that did not align with official doctrine began to disappear from public readings, manuscript copies, and over time, from collective memory. Christianity became increasingly institutionalized, and with that, less tolerant of internal diversity. The persecution of groups considered heretical soon intensified. The Council of Nicaea in 325, convened by Emperor Constantine, did not determine the final list of biblical books, but it was decisive in consolidating a model of unified faith. The focus there was doctrinal, but the standardization of texts would soon follow as a direct consequence of this effort toward cohesion. The final definition of the sacred books took place at the end of the 4th century. In 397, the Council of Carthage officially approved a list of texts that were to comprise the Bible. Those that were not included were definitively rejected. Gospels such as those of Thomas, Philip, and Judas were banned, their contents condemned, and their followers silenced. They were considered threats to Christianity, which was consolidating itself as the religion of the empire. This process not only shaped the Christian faith, but also sealed the fate of hundreds of writings. Many were burned, destroyed, or hidden by those who still considered them sacred, and for centuries it was believed that they had been erased forever. But history sometimes has its own ways of preserving things. In 1945, an accidental discovery in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, changed everything. Local workers found ceramic jars buried in a cave, and inside them, manuscripts that seemed to have survived the centuries intact. Gnostic texts, considered heretical for so long, were there, preserved. Their words, long forgotten, began to circulate again among researchers and those interested in the hidden side of Christian tradition. Among the works recovered over the following decades, one attracted particular attention: the so-called Gospel of Judas. Found in the late 1970s, it presented a deeply unsettling perspective on the most rejected disciple in Christian history. The existence of this gospel, after all that had been done to erase it, raised an uncomfortable question. If even it had survived forced oblivion, what else might be hidden? And why does its message still cause discomfort among those who study the ways of faith? For 2,000 years, a single name has carried the weight of all human disloyalty. Judas Iscariot has become synonymous with betrayal, the figure of the disciple who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Few biblical characters have been so condemned, so fixed in the collective memory as symbols of absolute error. However, there is an ancient account that offers another perspective, a text that challenges the widely accepted version, bringing a reinterpretation that few would be prepared to face. In the traditional Gospels, Judas is the obvious antagonist. In John, he is described as someone possessed by Satan. In Matthew, his repentance ends in suicide after trying to return the payment for the betrayal. Mark and Luke reinforce his role as the weak link among the 12. Everything points to a man driven by ambition, unable to resist temptation and corruption. However, when the Gospel of Judas is opened, this construction collapses. In it, the character does not appear as someone inferior, but as the only disciple capable of understanding the depth of Jesus' mission. He is not the villain. He is the confidant, and more than that, he is the one chosen to carry out a task that no one else would have the courage or discernment to perform. The contrast is shocking. While the other disciples are portrayed as stuck in misguided interpretations, clinging to earthly beliefs, Judas is presented as the one who received secret revelations. According to this text, his action was not the result of weakness, but part of a plan known to Jesus, a necessary sacrifice guided by the Master himself as part of a greater design. The inevitable question arises, why then did tradition choose to immortalize him as a traitor? The answer may lie less in theology and more in religious politics. Early Christian leaders needed a solid foundation on which to build their faith. Electing figures such as Peter as the foundations of the church required maintaining the image of the traditional apostles as the legitimate heirs of Christ's message. A text that portrayed Judas as the true knower of the truth threatened this construct. It destabilized what was being built. Accepting the Gospel of Judas would mean revising the foundations of Christianity. After all, if the one who was painted as the traitor was, in fact, the only one who fully understood the divine purpose, then the others would not be teachers, but disciples who were still learning. And that would completely change the spiritual hierarchy established over the centuries. The structure of the accepted Gospels leads the reader down a linear path. Jesus teaches, the apostles follow, Judas fails. The story ends with the crucifixion as a direct consequence of this supposed betrayal. The alternative text, however, dismantles this logic. Jesus, aware that his sacrifice was inevitable, entrusts Judas with the role of ensuring that it is fulfilled. It is not betrayal, it is obedience. It is not corruption, it is deep understanding. Another point that this gospel highlights is the limitation of the other disciples. Those who, in the official version, would be the founders of the church, are described as incapable of grasping the essence of the mission. Their practices are seen as distorted, their rituals as deviations from the true path. Judas, isolated among them, would be the only one who accessed this superior knowledge, something reserved, intimate, revealed beyond the reach of the others. The implication of this is clear. The Gospel of Judas questions the role of the church as the sole guardian of truth. It dismantles the logic of a central authority, showing that true understanding could lie outside the dominant structure. This alone would explain the effort to erase this text from history. Even today, the mere existence of this gospel is disturbing. It not only offers a new interpretation of a central event, but demands a re-examination of everything that has been taught as unquestionable. If Judas was not a traitor, then the crucifixion was something accepted or even desired by Jesus. And in that case, the concepts of good and evil within the story itself are turned upside down. The weight of this revelation is not small. It opens the door to something even more disturbing. If the image of Judas has been so distorted, how many other elements of tradition may have followed the same path? What other figures, episodes, and teachings have been shaped to serve purposes that were not exactly spiritual? When everything you have learned from an early age begins to crumble, the natural impulse is to resist, to defend the certainties, rituals, and symbols that have shaped your life. But there are texts that do not ask for permission to be accepted. They simply appear, and in doing so, they open cracks in what seemed solid. The Gospel of Judas is one such text. It not only rehabilitates the most hated figure in the traditional Gospels, but redefines the structure of reality itself. It points to something greater, more complex, and deeply uncomfortable. The idea of a single, absolute, omniscient, and benevolent creator is one of the pillars of Christianity. In the official scriptures, this God is responsible for everything, from light to human beings, from cosmic order to individual destiny. But the Gnostics followed another path. For them, this God of creation was not the highest. He was, in fact, a limited entity who took control of an imperfect reality and sold it as divine work, an inferior architect masquerading as absolute. According to this understanding, the physical world was not made out of love or for a higher purpose, but rather as a mechanism of control, a prison disguised as paradise. This prison would be ruled by a being called Yaldabaoth, a kind of cosmic impostor, the fruit of ignorance, who took on the role of God and demanded worship. He is the one who rules the cycle of suffering, illusion, and repetition that marks material existence. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus recognizes this reality and shares it only with one disciple, the one whom, ironically, history has turned into a symbol of betrayal. While the others continue without understanding, Judas receives a deeper explanation. Jesus reveals that his mission is not to reinforce the current system, but to break it. He did not come to confirm creation, but to point to a way out. And for that to happen, someone must do the unthinkable, surrender the body, liberate the essence. The world we know, according to this text, is only one layer, the densest and most deceptive. Above it, there is a higher plane, inhabited by pure entities, where the true God lives. This God does not seek worship, does not dictate rules, does not manipulate through fear. He simply is, and only those who awaken to this knowledge can free themselves from the influence of the lesser creator. This idea is deeply unsettling, because if it is true, everything changes. Faith based on blind obedience, systems of religious authority, rituals and dogmas, all of this loses its foundation. Knowledge, not submission, becomes the path to salvation. And not just any knowledge, but an internal, silent understanding that cannot be imposed by any institution. The decision to hide this gospel makes more sense in this context. If it had been widely accepted, the structure of Christianity as we know it would not have survived. There would be no room for a punitive God, no fear of hell, no church mediating salvation. There would only be a call to lucidity, to personal discovery, to awakening to a truth that challenges what is visible. This view is not alone. Other cultures, traditions, and philosophies also suggest that the material world is only an appearance, an illusion that hides something more real. What Gnosticism proposes is an invitation to confrontation. Are we living within a carefully constructed lie? And if so, why has it been so well sustained for so long? If Judas was the only one to receive this revelation, his historical condemnation takes on new meaning. Perhaps he was not the traitor who handed Jesus over to his enemies, but the bearer of a key. Someone who accepted to carry the weight of a necessary act, not out of disloyalty, but out of an understanding of the greater purpose behind the sacrifice. The Gospel of Judas, emerging after centuries of concealment, does not ask for acceptance. It demands reflection. Its content does not seek to replace one faith with another, but rather to dismantle the illusion that there is only one possible truth. Whether it will one day be integrated into the official history of the faith or remain relegated to the sidelines depends less on the Church and more on the courage of those who dare to ask the right questions. The versions that define what is or is not sacred never arise by chance. Since the early days of Christianity, what became official was carefully chosen, not only out of spiritual conviction, but out of a need for control. Certain texts were elevated to the status of unquestionable truth, while others were buried under accusations of heresy, often not because they lacked value, but because they threatened the foundations that would sustain the emerging authority of the Church. The Gospel of Judas is one such example. Its content was not ignored because it appeared to be false, but because it represented a direct threat to the religious model that was being constructed. In the early centuries of the Christian faith, there was no single voice. There were many. Communities scattered across different regions transmitted the teachings of Jesus according to their own understanding. Among them, the Gnostics offered a radically different view from what would become dominant. For them, salvation was not achieved through dogma, churches, or blind obedience. It depended on something internal, profound, revealed only to those who were ready to see the hidden knowledge of true reality. This idea was revolutionary and dangerous. If the truth were within the reach of every individual, if no one needed an intermediary between themselves and the divine, then the function of priests, temples, and rituals became dispensable. The very existence of the ecclesiastical structure would be called into question. The Gospel of Judas, with its proposal of a Christ who revealed secrets and a Judas who was the recipient of this wisdom, represented precisely this kind of threat. The nascent church, seeking unification and legitimacy, could not allow such plurality. In the 2nd century, Irenaeus of Lyon began the selection process. In his writings, he harshly condemned all gospels that contradicted the more institutionalized view of Jesus. According to him, only 4 versions should be considered authentic: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not because they were the oldest or most faithful to the facts, but because they upheld a theology compatible with the organization that was consolidating. Over time, this movement intensified as Christianity gained strength within the Roman Empire, transforming itself from a persecuted sect to a state religion. The urgency to create a single, closed, unquestionable body of doctrine also grew. At the Council of Nicaea, held in the year 325, Christian leaders took the first steps toward establishing the foundations of orthodoxy. Unity had to be protected at all costs, and that meant eliminating differences. That is how the Gospels considered apocryphal disappeared. Some were destroyed, burned as heresy. Others survived in secret, kept by groups that refused to abandon their beliefs. The Gospel of Judas, like so many others, was restricted to distorted references made by its opponents, the only ones who could talk about it, since its original content had been banned. But what made this gospel so unacceptable? The answer lies in its central messages. By claiming that the apostles did not understand Jesus' teachings, the text suggested that the foundation of the church was built on misinterpretations. By describing the Creator God as an inferior and deceitful being, it directly attacked the foundation of traditional Christianity, which relies heavily on continuity with the Old Testament. Rejection, therefore, was not just a spiritual issue. It was a strategic choice made by a leadership that wanted to maintain the cohesion of an expanding religion. In a scenario where Christianity was no longer just a belief, but was occupying political space, any teaching that threatened the order had to be silenced. Even so, time acted as a guardian. The Gospel of Judas survived, hidden, until the moment when it could be read again and questioned. Today, its content provokes more curiosity than condemnation. It invites reflection, doubt, and a re-evaluation of a history that may never have been told in its entirety. After all, what if what was considered dangerous was, in fact, what came closest to the forgotten truth? Not everything remains hidden forever. There are moments when fragments of the past return, bringing with them questions that challenge centuries of convictions. The Gospel of Judas is one such fragment. Forgotten for almost 2 millennia, this text emerged in the 20th century as a missing piece in a still incomplete puzzle about the early years of Christianity. It was in 1978 that the manuscript's existence came to light after being acquired by a group of antique dealers. Found in Egypt, the document was kept in poor conditions for years, stored in a safe where time slowly wore it away. Only decades later was it handed over to experts who, with patience and technology, managed to restore and translate its almost lost pages. The world only had access to its full translation in 2006, a delay that, in itself, speaks volumes about the fear that texts like this still provoke. The publication was supported by the National Geographic Society, which also released a series of studies and documentaries explaining the content and importance of the manuscript. The text surprised readers by presenting Judas not as a traitor, but as the only disciple who understood Jesus' mission. This interpretation broke with everything that tradition had taught and generated immediate reactions. For scholars such as Bart Ehrman, the value of the Gospel of Judas does not necessarily lie in its historical literalness, but in what it represents as a testimony to a pluralistic era. It shows that 1st and 2nd century Christianity was not a homogeneous faith, but rather a field rife with doctrinal disputes, competing interpretations, and conflicting views of who Jesus was. Professor Elaine Pagels also drew attention to the political impact of the text. According to her, the content of the gospel was not rejected because it was meaningless, but because it destabilized the religious hierarchy that was forming. A teaching that decentralized power could never be welcomed by an institution that was consolidating itself as the sole mediator between the divine and the faithful. The Church's reaction was immediate. It officially declared that the text did not change the traditional understanding of Judas in any way. For the Vatican, it was just another Gnostic writing with no theological value. But the fact that it was buried and recovered raises a bigger question. How many other stories are still hidden? If this content has touched you in any way and you believe in the importance of continuing to explore topics forgotten by official history, please consider supporting our work with any contribution. This helps us to deepen our research and bring new discoveries to each video. Thank you for walking with us.